Breaking news out of the NBA, they have suspended Phoenix Suns and Mercury owner Robert Sarver for 1 year and fined him $10 million for engaging in what the league called, quote, workplace misconduct. Now, the punishment stemmed from a long investigation into allegations of sexual misconduct and racism that came to light in an ESPN report from last November. Sarver, who has owned the Suns since 2004, will have to complete a training program focused on respect and appropriate conduct while serving his suspension. As you take a look at three of the key findings that were mentioned in the NBA's press release, that Sarver used the N-word on at least 5 different occasions. He made sex-related comments, inappropriate comments about women in the workplace, and engaged in inappropriate physical conduct towards male employees. Also engaged in demeaning and harsh treatment of employees, including cursing and yelling at them. All right, for more on this, let's now welcome in NBA writer Bill Reiter, our coach, CBS NBA analyst Avery Johnson, and Nothing Personal podcast host David Samson. First, let's get some reaction from you gentlemen, starting here with you, Bill. Are you surprised at the punishment and, more importantly, the length of the punishment?
I can tell you that there are some people around the NBA that I talked to and texted with in the last hour that are a little surprised, but as one GM pointed out to me as the news came down, this is the same commissioner, Adam Silver, and I know there's an independent investigation that got the findings. But you're talking about a guy in Silver who a few years ago kicked out an owner from the NBA in Donald Sterling for alleged racist behavior. So there's a pattern here for this commissioner in this sport being willing to be pretty aggressive about bringing down the hammer on owners who they feel have embarrassed the association. So I think as folks process this around the NBA, I think some of the response might actually be the fact that Sarver got off a little easier when you compare it to Donald Sterling. So no, in the final analysis, I'm not surprised that the NBA and Adam Silver were willing to bring down a pretty harsh punishment given the allegations that are in this report.
Well, my biggest thought right now is, how is this going to sit with specifically the African-American players, his coach who's African-American, his general manager, James Jones, and Monty Williams, who I'm talking about. How's this going to affect them moving forward based on the findings of this independent investigation that they found, all of these different instances where he's, said the N-word, the way he treated female employees, cursing at the team, what type of feeling are they going to have, as they continue to rehabilitate this situation and when he returns to the team after a year? Is this a situation where after a year, are they going to still want to work for the Phoenix Suns and all of the employees that are behind the scenes that are minorities? So there have a lot of question marks moving forward. There is precedent where Adam Silver, as Bill alluded to, has forced an NBA owner out. Obviously, this didn't happen in this situation, but we don't know what's going to happen in the future if he's going to be forced to sell the team. And that wasn't, we're not privy to that information as of today.
I think it's very important to note here, Jeremy, that when the NBA released its statement, it made it very clear on the bottom of page 1, and I want to make sure I read it exactly correctly. The investigation made no finding that Mr. Sarver's workplace misconduct was motivated by racial or gender-based animus. And that is what they are using to say, we're suspending him for a year, we're fining him $10 million, but we're not going to force him to sell his team. We are differentiating between what he did and what Donald Sterling did. And by no means does that make this right in any stretch of anyone's imagination, but it gives you an idea where the NBA wanted to end up after this investigation and where obviously the investigation did end up.
Okay, so David, what role would other owners have played in not having him force the sale, not having Silver force the sale, and allowing him to keep the team and take the 1-year suspension?
So this is something that we talk about in owners' meetings a lot. You talk about it not during the public part of the meeting, but when you're doing sidebars or having meals during owners' meetings. You're talking about what does it take for a commissioner? What would we want to ever have the commissioner agree that this is when we force a sale? Because owners all realize if you force the sale of somebody, that means you could be next. and no owner wants to be forced to sell his team before he's ready. So this is an example where they worked with the commissioner. I am sure NBA owners were involved in this. They understood what the investigation resulted in. They knew what it was going to result in, and they wanted to make sure that they could find a way to not force him to sell, because I am convinced that Robert Sarver is not the only owner who engages in conduct like this. It's not the only front office where there is misogyny and other issues that are really delineated inside this statement that the NBA made. The Mavericks had a situation like this, as you know. So what the NBA is saying is, get your human resources department in order. You're gone for a year, and we're going to take it from there.
Sarver owns both the Suns and the Mercury. He also owns a second division Spanish soccer club in Mallorca. Bill, how does this suspension affect the Suns front office at this point and this organization moving forward?
Well, I think Coach hit on this in a big way. It really depends on the reaction of the people in that organization who do or don't feel offended enough that they feel like they want to make a change professionally. James Jones is an incredibly well-respected GM. Chris Paul is obviously a great player on the floor and a leader in the social justice movement within the NBA and a part of the NBA Players Association leadership. So I think the question will come down to individuals, Jeremy, and how they want to respond. And I think to David's point, which is a great one, part of the reason that Donald Sterling no longer owns an NBA team and Robert Sarver is going to is because of the outcry of all of us, right? The media, fans. That Sterling story, which I covered when I was in LA, was a huge story. It was in the news every day. And I know Silver moved pretty quickly when that news came down, but it was a major story. This piece of investigative journalism from ESPN.com came out a year ago. And it's been intermittently in the news and sometimes talked about, but it hasn't captured the public imagination the same way. And to answer your question about the front office and basketball operations, I think it depends if there's going to be an outcry that either happens publicly or happens internally with players and people who are part of that organization, and that remains to be seen.
Avery, what kind of a message does this send to the rest of the league?
Well, it sends a powerful message that this type of behavior based on the independent investigation is not going to be tolerated. And as David alluded to, get your HR departments and your human resources departments in order. And there needs to be an accountability even for NBA owners, because the NBA owners, they don't, except for a guy like a Michael Jordan, they don't really look like the players. All right, it's a different culture, different situation. So you got to have some more accountability, guidelines in the way you communicate with your players, the way you communicate with female employees. And if you cross the line too many times, you're going to have to pay a price. So this sent a strong message. Within the ownership group, there are executive committees that vote on all of this and that communicate with Adam Silver. So they were in tune with this. So I think it's sending a strong message that this type of behavior, based on what the findings were, is not going to be tolerated.
David, we've seen similar accusations and investigations with the likes of Daniel Snyder in the NFL and that league punishment, which was largely called a joke outside of the league. The NBA is a league that is socially conscious. They always seem to be ahead of the curve. What does this punishment do in terms of setting a precedent, not only for the NBA, but perhaps for other leagues?
So it's interesting. We always would look at other leagues and what they're doing and how they're punishing players, how they're punishing owners or people in the front office. And I found this to be pretty light. And what Bill said, I think we have to focus on. The NBA is reacting to whether or not this is a huge story and whether or not the story has legs. And the problem is that shouldn't matter. When you're dealing with these type of issues, when you're dealing with racism or misogyny, it should not be what the general public feels. It should be, what do you think is right and what do you think is wrong? $10 million is the most the fine can be under the NBA rules. I understand that. The problem with suspending him for a year and saying he can't go to league meetings, he can't go to games, he can't go to practices, he's still the owner of the team. It's almost like when you have a manager who's ejected from a game. I know very well that manager is managing the game from his office. I promise you that Robert Sarver is still going to be involved in the operation of the Phoenix Suns. And to Avery's point, how will Monty Williams react? How will Chris Paul react? Because if they raise this to another level, the NBA is going to have to take a fresh look at the future of Robert Sarver.
Yeah, David, I think David's absolutely right. If there is the NBA and even Adam Silver, who again, commendable commissioner, but any commissioner works for the owners and the betterment of the league, not for whatever we think is morally correct, not for the quote unquote right outcome, though I'd like to be Pollyannish enough to believe that motivates folks. It tends not to in major businesses. This is about what they can do in terms of getting away with not punishing Sarver too much, as long as they're on the right side of public pressure. And guys, if there's not an outcry, if this story gets moved on in the fish wrap of newspaper speak of 20 years ago, and the next thing is the thing people are focused on, David's right. It's $10 million. It's a lot of money. It's not the end of the world. Sarver's still going to be the owner. And I promise you, every person in that organization who wants to move up, who wants to keep their job, who wants to go from scout to being a GM, whatever the case may be, a player who's on the fringes is going to know that Sarver makes the decisions in the long term, and you have to toe the line. I think what's going to be really interesting is the reaction from people that are part of that organization, that have some power, whether it's the GM or it's a star player or it's a head coach, and whether or not they feel like, and it's a personal choice, they want to utilize that power and jeopardize maybe their situation in that organization to speak out against Sarver, to demand more of a punishment. If that happens, the story lives on. If it doesn't, guys, this is probably near the end of the Sarver conversation in a really mainstream way.
Yeah, and you're also talking about a guy like Devin Booker. Devin Booker, who's, coming off of, a couple of really good years. Obviously, they lost to Dallas in Game 7 and got embarrassed. But the year before, they lost to the Milwaukee Bucks in the NBA Finals. He's coming off, just signed a recent extension. Here's a guy that's becoming a household name, obviously, more on that superstar status. They just re-signed begrudgingly DeAndre Ayton in the offseason after he was a restricted free agent. So you got some other guys on that team, Mikal Bridges, young star players that's going to be around, barring any injury, for a long time. How are they going to feel in this type of culture, playing for this owner? Do they want to stick around to play under this type of cloud, especially when Sarver comes back, after another year? So even though Chris Paul and Monty Williams and James Jones, all those guys are significantly important, it's the other guys, specifically a Devin Booker, what's going to be his temperature as he meets with Donald Sterling, to not meet with Sterling, obviously, but to meet with Sarver and ask him, hey, what's going on here? Is all of these findings true? Is, this independent investigation, is this accurate? Did you communicate this way with players? Did you communicate this way with female employees? So I think that's going to be significantly important moving forward.
Keep in mind the level of player empowerment in the NBA, and a story that just happened this offseason when Kevin Durant said, I don't want to play with Steve Nash and Sean Marks. You have to get rid of your GM and coach. The owner got involved, and all of a sudden it's kumbaya time. What happens if Devin Booker or several members of the Phoenix Suns organization, what if they stand up and say, you know what? I don't want to play for this owner. That's something that Adam Silver has to have in the back of his mind. And prior to any sort of punishment like this, there has to have been conversations with the union, the players, because that would be ugly if that happened.
Former baseball executive and the host of Nothing Personal with David Samson. David Samson joining us, the coach, NBA analyst Avery Johnson, and NBA writer Bill Reiter to discuss the one-year suspension and fine handed down to Phoenix Suns owner Robert Sarver on Tuesday. Here's a look at what the NBA had in its press release in terms of three major allegations that Sarver had used the N-word on at least 5 different occasions. He made sex-related comments, inappropriate comments about women in the workplace, and engaged in inappropriate physical conduct towards male employees. He also engaged in demeaning and harsh treatment of employees, including cursing and yelling at them. He has been suspended for 1 year and fined $10 million by the NBA.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.